So we're going to be working through now some sort of common mistakes or things that we would discourage you to do. But then there's actually a couple of trickier points which are a bit contentious. So we'll go through those in a second. So first of all, what I'm generally encouraging is that you avoid being too brief or nondescript. So that would be, for example, just writing the sentence, upon seeing the key selection criterion that asks you to talk about high impact teaching strategies, you might have a bit of a throwaway sentence that just says, I've previously applied HITS to my teaching, full stop, and then you move on. So not really helpful. The reason for that is it's a sentence that doesn't really say anything. So what high impact teaching strategies, how have you used them, what was the result? Really, that's what your reader is going to be asking if they just read that sentence by itself. So really use your key selection criteria response as an opportunity to highlight specific aspects of your experience. So describe the situation, reflect on the impact of your actions, demonstrate the skills that you'll then be able to apply to the school that you're applying to. So drawing that connection between what you've already done and how you're going to align with that school. Try to avoid repeating what's already in your CV or cover letter. And I don't mean excluding experience altogether because it's on your CV. I mean, if you had a dot point that talked about your role in a school production, I wouldn't just write role in school, like involvement in school production as its own dot point and then not actually elaborate on it anywhere in your whole application. So again, your key selection criteria response extends what's already been outlined in your CV and cover letter. So reflect on the experience that these documents actually haven't already addressed. So this is the space where you're adding value by letting the school get to know you better. There is a bit of a balance to strike between the writing style that you use. So there can be a tendency to write too professionally. It's not an academic essay. Show your personality through, but also don't talk like you're talking to a friend on the phone on a Friday night after you've had a long week. Again, there is a balance to strike in terms of how you write your response. We also discourage you from including what could be construed as inappropriate content. So really use your key selection criteria to only reflect your own ideas and experience. So an inspirational quote from a thought leader that inspires you, that's probably not the space to talk about it in your key selection criteria response. Neither would be testimonials. So testimonials can be great to take along with you as material into your interview, but probably not best to draw from in your key selection criteria response. So that could be testimonials from students or mentor teachers, like references, because of course reference checking side of the process for your application as well. And discussing the testimonials or quotes and other things like that could actually detract from the criterion itself, which is what you're there to respond to. So it's just important to keep that focus in your response. And again, as we've already experienced working through the meatiness of some of these criterion, you'll have plenty to talk about just responding to those. So it's all about getting the balance right. So as I said already, sometimes we can look at the criterion and feel a little bit intimidated and think, oh my gosh, I have to provide one example that addresses this whole thing. How am I ever going to do that? Do I have to include the whole criterion? Do I have to just talk about one example? Oh, I should talk about 20 things I've done to answer this criterion. What is a good, again, this is all just guidance. This is not a rule, but a good balance that you can think about to aim for would be 2 to 3 different examples to include to address each criterion. So why is that? So that could provide you with the opportunity to address different parts of the criterion. So again, you might choose to pull out one part. You might be looking at student assessment, how you've implemented an assessment task, how you then use that data to inform student growth, that sort of thing. You could pull out different parts and actually have different examples for those different areas. You could actually use different examples to reflect different parts of your experience. So if you've held different roles in your career, excuse me, just a moment. You did not have technical difficulties. I just had the worst tickle in my throat. I'm so sorry. So again, you may have held different types of roles throughout your experience. You might have different subject areas. So for example, I was an English and drama teacher. So I might actually want to use one criterion to talk about my experiences in the drama role and then in my subject area for English. So I would need different examples to be able to do that. You might want to talk about different programs. You might want to take an example to actually talk about a growth area. So it just allows you to actually stagger that out and look at things a little bit more closely. But not only that, I'm going back to that sort of 10 dot point examples or 20 dot point examples. If you're trying to do that in one page to address one criterion, you're probably not going to be able to go into much depth about any one thing. And that could actually detract from what you're trying to communicate as a whole. So having 2 to 3 examples actually just offers enough space for you to be able to flesh things out a little bit more. So you've got a bit of variety in addressing a criterion, but you've also been able to delve into it a little bit more deeply. So again, it's about the balance. So we get to these contentious areas. So there might be the question that comes up to say, all right, well, taking all of that guidance for writing into account, is it okay if I use dot points? Yes and no. So you can use dot points if you're wanting to just have a bit of a starting point to provide multiple examples that you then plan to elaborate on. If you're just noting sort of simpler things like just using statistics or data, that can be really good to dot point. For example, you might want to show how you had influence to improve student results or growing enrollments in a subject area. Like that would be awesome to put as dot points. You don't really need to flesh those out. But, or you might just be trying to list sort of well-known concepts that again, you're going to elaborate later. I would say don't use dot points if you're only using dot points. So if your whole example is response to that criterion is just dot points, there really needs to be that question of whether or not you actually have the opportunity to elaborate upon anything effectively. Or if the point as it stands by itself has no meaning or substance. If you don't plan on elaborating on it, if it's a little bit ambiguous just sitting there by itself, it's probably not worth using. It's just not going to help your response, that's all. So as an example of using dot points, here's a section where someone has said, my recent role as the head of drama has enabled me to broaden opportunities for collaboration and communication, working within other teams. So this person has actually listed some teams that they've had involvement with. So other heads of department, the drama teaching team, the school leadership team, and parents of the arts committee. Then they go on to say the most challenging but rewarding aspects of this collaboration involve me working closely with other heads of department to develop and trial methods of utilising arts across the curriculum. So with the things that have just been mentioned, how has this educator effectively used dot points? Well, they've not only put the dot points there to show a few different examples of collaboration and communication, but they've then selected one to elaborate upon. So they decided, all right, well, I'm actually going to have an example about how I've worked with heads of department to try and get some things off the ground around arts across the curriculum. So then they'd probably go into talking about that situation and the impact that arts across the curriculum had and how they influenced that. So that's a really good use of dot points. The second point is it okay if I use overviews? So an overview is sort of an introductory section or paragraph to a criterion, and I've seen overviews used a fair bit. So this is a bit of another point of contention. Is it okay? Again, yes and no. So yes, if you elaborate upon all of the points that you mention in your overview, or if you want to just demonstrate your understanding of a concept. So it might be just to make a definition that you then go into by incorporating your examples. I would say don't use an overview. If it's really broad and generic, for example, it's really important that we provide a safe and positive space for all of our students. Everybody thinks that. So it might be worth discussing by creating breakout spaces in the classroom. We can create a positive and safe environment for our students. That could actually be part of your overview that you then go into more detail through an example. Also, as I mentioned in the yes part, if you're elaborating on all the points, that's all good. If you mention something in the overview that you never mention again, probably not worth using because that's not really an overview. So an example of using an overview that's been really effective. So this is addressing the second key selection criteria pointer about high impact teaching strategies. So this person has said, within my classroom, the high impact teaching strategies that I prioritize most are setting goals and questioning. I believe these strategies work hand in hand to support student growth by fostering their persistent curiosity and engaged, purposeful work. By integrating varied goal setting practices and questioning sources into each lesson, I strive to create an environment where students are managing their learning independently. So by reading this overview, what do you think this educator is going to focus on within their response? Well, they've clearly indicated that they're going to talk about high impact teaching strategies, but specifically setting goals and questioning. So what we can expect from reading that is we're probably going to see an example of having goal setting practices as part of day-to-day lessons, and also having different sources for student questioning. So that could be peer-to-peer, through the use of ICT, through research projects, etc. So already from there, we can see some branches coming out where some different examples could be used to have a really in-depth response to this criterion. So just some general writing tips. You might want to think about some prompting questions. So to get yourself started, we've already sort of touched on this, but what particular part of the criterion are you going to be discussing? You might actually do things the other way around. And as I said, if you're just having a bit of a reflection and decide to dot point lots of bits and pieces that are standing out for you from things you've achieved in the last 12 months as a teacher, some sort of key programs you've been involved with on your placements as a pre-service teacher, you might actually have those things down first and then work in the opposite way. So I'm actually looking for, how can I fit this experience into one of the criterion? So it's important to then think about making sure that that criterion actually, so the example actually does address something. So it does address one part of the criterion. So then it's about setting the scene, what happened and what was the result of your actions. So that follow through is really important. Just a couple of notes there. I mentioned under explaining, which is why the 1-page response per criterion is a good guide, because it's better to over explain than under explain. A big thing to remember, the application panel doesn't know you. They haven't shadowed your experience directly. So sometimes you might feel like there's some things that are quite obvious, or, oh, just by saying that, that person will know what I mean. Not necessarily. So sometimes it might feel like you're over explaining, but better to over explain than under explain. Something else to question, again, if you've maybe had a go at starting to draft some of your response and then you're reading back through it, it's good to question yourself. So does this response or example explore who, what, when, where, how, why, especially how and why, which is why I've made them bold, or is it just the what? So we're going back to our example of, I have used high impact teaching strategies in my teaching. If we were to look at that as that standalone sentence that moves on, we're kind of just looking at a what, high impact teaching strategies, but it's not even a what, because we don't know which high impact teaching strategies are being referred to. So that person would really need to flesh things out further. There's also the STAR method, or you may have heard of the STARE method even. So this can be a really good way to try and flesh your response out further. In addition to that who, what, when, where, how, why questioning. If there's an example you really want to use, but you're not too sure how to work through the situation or tell the story of it, you can simply start by, what was the situation? What was the task at hand? So maybe your role or responsibility in that situation. So especially when we work as part of a team, you might have had a situation, but what part did you play in that situation? How did you complete a task, or what action took place, and what was the result of that action? So you're really focusing on your own contributions throughout that, again, if you're working in a team through a scenario. But then there's also the E. So an extension, that's a good place to look at if you're thinking about, okay, well, this was a situation that didn't work out, or this is something I would like to grow on further, or here is the experience I've had, even though I haven't, again, we're going back to the PYP example, I haven't worked in a PYP school before, but this experience would connect to it by relevancy to like inquiry focus, emotional intelligence building, da 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 da. So it's just a way of you being able to connect what experience you've had so far with what the school is actually asking for or looking for. So an extension section can be really valuable. So we come to managing your inexperience, which again, as we've learned from the school advice, is nothing to shy away from. So demonstrate, first of all, if you've got a key selection criteria section, so one of the criterion, there might be a concept that you haven't really had a chance to look at or developed your experience with. So something really important will be to still acknowledge it and define it to show that you at least have an understanding of it. You can then gear towards, in your response, maybe discussing future goals. So now that I understand this concept, this is something I would like to do, and this is how I would set about doing it. And also tying that to the needs of the school. So especially if we're focusing on that sneaky 6th key selection criteria that's been involved, it's really important to draw on that to understand the needs of the school. Or again, if you're researching the school and it's like, oh wow, this program is everywhere, I should really talk about it somewhere in my criteria response. That's a way of drawing it in to show the needs of the school and how you're willing to develop your practice to meet those expectations. And ultimately, don't be hard on yourself. Try not to frame it negatively. Ultimately, we're in education because we love learning, and there's always things to learn in the education space. So it's really just about managing how you're going to continue to build it and just showing a commitment to doing that as well. Another piece of advice, especially at the moment, jobs will start to be advertised, but really you can see jobs popping up right through October, November, December. I myself didn't get my position as a teacher until the week before Christmas. But at the agency, we can hear about roles. Schools will come to us for support in filling a role the week before term 1 starts. So they can really come out all along the way. So through those months, you might find yourself applying for multiple positions. So what you're aiming for is, when you're creating this 5-page document that looks at all these examples and is really rich and deep, don't feel like you have to start again every single time. So you might have a working document that you pull parts out to align with that particular school, because to an extent there are going to be some common values and some common programs, but at the same time, like your experience is also has a limit with what you've done so far. So it is about creating a workable document. So you might have a document and you just have a few examples and you're sort of copying and pasting to form 1. I myself even just had a standard document that I used, and then if I had schools that had slight changes with the criterion, I just had like extra parts that I would put in because when I first graduated, I was applying for lots of things. So you're really just trying to make this process as straightforward as possible, if nothing else, just to keep your sanity, because it can feel daunting at first. But you've got all this advice now, so you'll get through it. And then just more housekeeping things. Make sure you proofread. I'm a big fan of reading things out to myself, so I seem like that crazy person talking to themselves. Have another teacher read it, your mentor teacher, a principal person, a principal team member read it. Even someone who's not in education, sometimes it can actually be really useful to have someone who's not in that world have a read through, because they might pull out some questions or even some grammatical errors or other things with their different perspective, or even just fresh eyes looking at the document for you, so you feel confident that it's as good as it can be when you're applying. Make sure, and it again sounds silly, but because you've got a few different components that you're submitting via Recruitment Online, you've got your cover letter, which might be a separate file, you've got your CV, and then you've got your key selection criteria response. First of all, if you've got multiple key selection criteria responses, make sure you send the right one to the right school. I have put my hand up. I have sent the wrong one to the wrong school. And make sure you've got every single piece every single time. But try and keep them as separate documents, because you might have on the other side of things with the panel different people assessing different parts of your application. Still try to keep separate files, just so from a management organization perspective, things are coming through effectively to the right people on the other side when you do your application. Oh, and I didn't proofread this PowerPoint, so it's a worked example. Proofread. But I wanted to add as well just where to go for further help. So there's some great education Facebook groups. For example, ANZUK, we have area-specific Facebook groups, which are really supportive communities of educators with different experience. So there can be some great points for discussion, or through that you might actually meet somebody. They work in your area. They might have the same subjects as you that could buddy up and offer that peer support, especially as a CRT. It can be a little bit hard to find those people. But also there's some great education mentor mentee style Facebook groups as well. So maybe have a play with some keywords when you're searching for your groups to find a group that way. You might go back to your mentor teachers and get them to not necessarily write it with you, but just to do some proofreading, or even principal class contacts. When I first graduated, I had a short-term contract at a school. It was a really little school, and they actually had nothing for me at the end of my short-term contract, but I had a really good relationship with the principal. And I remember I sent across my key selection criteria response, and she sent it back to me, and 3/4 of it was changed to red because she said, might need another look at this. That I was really grateful that I had a chance to have a couple of goes with her, and we got there in the end, but I wouldn't have been able to get my role without her help. So if I'd submitted it the way it was, I wouldn't have gotten very far. So I owe a lot to her. So principal class, of course, they're heavily involved in the application process with the panel. So a good contacts to have if you have them. So we're just going to move along to some case studies. I'm sort of wary of time. I am a chatterbox. So of course, we'd look to keep it to the hour, but it'd be really great now to get some advice from everyone now that you've had a chance to reflect upon some of this advice, and maybe you're thinking about your own response and how that could be tweaked and improved. As I mentioned, some brave educators put their hands up to actually have their little excerpts involved for this session. So thank you so much. So this person, their response, they've said, my classroom teaching is guided by how students learn. Therefore, I use a range of high impact teaching strategies in the classroom to allow students to access the curriculum. For example, I structure my lessons strategically and sensibly so that students can see where they have been and where they are going, setting goals to achieve in each lesson, week, and area of study. I explicitly introduce new concepts and scientific terms in psychology, such as cognitive dissonance perception theories of learning, and encourage students to make a glossary with examples, enabling multiple exposures as the concepts are discussed. So it is a longer response for this person, but they just had their majority of this page was dot points. So I've just picked out the first two, and then they had sort of that overview section at the start. So based on what we've looked at today, feel free to pop it into the chat, into that question section. How could this educator improve upon their response? So just people have a second to think. So I've had someone say, improve by being more specific about the high impact teaching strategies they use. Yep, Belinda, that's a great idea. You sort of get the impression from these dot points, you pick up that they're looking at goal setting, you've picked up that they're looking at multiple exposures, but really like by fleshing out just these 2 dot points, you could have your whole response. Someone said, remove the dot points. They read as overviews rather than examples. That's a really good point. Giving specific examples. Yep, because I feel like this person might think that they're giving an example, but there's so much more we could flesh out in terms of the who, what, when, where, how, why, the star or stare method to actually create a situation. So it might be too broad or general. Yep, agreed. We get a snapshot. I feel like we're getting little hints there. It's like, okay, awesome. I'd actually really love to know what happened in that psychology class. Maybe pick out where you were looking at theories of learning. What happened with the glossary? How did the students use the glossary? What was the result of using the glossary? I've got so many questions. So what is strategic or sensible about the lesson and structure? Someone has said, I've got some, these are all awesome ideas, everyone. Thank you so much, Amy, for contributing this example. I'm keen to actually grab some of these suggestions for you and send them across in an email because there's some really, really good ideas here. Like definitely an awesome start, but as I said, you've got so many more dot points that you provided in that example that page that you don't even really need. You could do so much just with these 2 points and flesh it out from there. So it's lovely to see that level of support. I just saw so many people write things at once. So thanks, guys. Moving on to case study 2. So this one's framed a little bit differently, especially in terms of just the way this person speaks, which I thought was really interesting. So my background in policing and professional sport means that I have the attributes to uphold the values of the modern day teacher within Victoria. It's been a long journey coming to the teaching profession, but it's one that I thrive on. Continually upskilling, honing my craft, and being better each day for my students is not only exciting but invigorating. The ability of CRT work to be able to reflect on my daily on my own performance and implement changes as required means each day I'm becoming a better teacher. So key selection, this is key selection criteria 5, but so they actually wrote that and then said, my teaching practice and past experience in policing and professional sport have consistently upheld these department values. As both a full-time teacher and CRT, I've continually reflected on my practice to make myself better. So what's interesting about this one, they've almost done it in reverse. They've put their overview at the end, almost like summary points, but then the bulk of that answer is actually that top paragraph. So again, let's just have a little think based on what we've learned today. How could this educator improve upon their response? I actually really love some of the language in here. You can tell this person's passionate. So they find, what they can do to hone their craft really invigorating, and it's exciting with what they've got to learn. And there's also hints of sort of prior experience and work in different industries. So again, someone's just said, how have you done this? Brilliant question, Kim. I'm wondering that myself. So how have you upheld the values? How do you continue to upskill? I'd love to talk a little bit more about how you make changes and reflect on your practice as a CRT, where you are sort of going into different settings every day or working with different groups of students. Not only does it give the students a clean slate, but you as well. So how do you have that ongoing reflection and development to make your experience better for your students? And also a great opportunity to draw on, I just want to learn about those transferable skills from the police force and how they go into informing you as a teacher. There's lots there. So this was an answer from Todd. So thank you so much for contributing that one, Todd. So yep, someone has said, maybe to paraphrase some of the terminology more specifically, that's a really interesting idea actually. And so someone's also talked about the 80-20 rule. So maybe they could talk a little bit more on expanding on their actual classroom experiences. Devin, that's an interesting idea, because, you could talk about policing, because obviously to this person, it was a very important part of their journey up until now. But then we're trying to look to bring it back into classroom. What are some examples? Probably looking at for more of a values and attributes side of things, but still certainly relevant. So awesome. Really nice to see some suggestions. Thank you everyone for being so forthcoming with the suggestions. It's really good to see. So really those are the 2 case studies that we were going to work through. So now we have questions. What I'm going to do is just take a moment, if you'll bear with me. Again, I'm conscious of time. We're nearly at 6 o'clock, but I would love to, again, I've probably overloaded you with information today, but if you still got a question that you don't think has been answered through this content, now's the time to ask. If I don't get through to your question, we do have record of all of these questions, and again, your email from when you registered. So if I don't get a chance to, maybe it's a really specific question or something quite extensive, I'll try and make an effort to contact you individually. I'll do my best. We have quite a few people here today and I'm one little person. So I will just, if you'll bear with me a second, go back through some of these questions just to see if I have addressed them or if I could open them up. As I mentioned already, there's a survey that will pop up once this webinar finishes, asking if you would like access to this PowerPoint. So all you have to do is say yes, and then I'll be able to put it through on OneDrive so that you have access to view the PowerPoint after today. So someone's already asked about how long to make it, full paragraphs or dot points. Hopefully, Anne, going through that writing advice has helped you a little bit with that one. Someone's asked about referring to on-site versus remote teaching. Certainly, given this year, there's probably going to be a lot of innovations and new ideas that people have had as a result of having to teach remotely. So there's so much that you can talk about there. So Milada, go for it. I think that's the remote teaching. It's definitely not any less than on-site teaching. We've had a lot of challenges this year, so definitely talking about that. Someone has asked, if you haven't graduated yet, when is the earliest that you can apply? So if you've completed your course and you're in that awkward position where you're waiting for your results to go through to get your VIT, if you have confirmation that you've passed everything, you should be able to start applying. VIT can take a little while, even if you've got everything ready to go with your results, it can take 4 to 6 weeks. So if you see a role that comes up, especially because the actual application process itself can take a little while from the school side, definitely feel free to start applying if you're ready. Someone has asked if they can bold words in their actual response. Yeah, definitely. So this is your document to tweak. You're obviously not changing the wording or what the key selection criteria is asking. It's more so to sort of help with your own ordering or even help to guide the reader. There's nothing wrong with that. Can we use academic knowledge to support our evidence? Do we need to cite and reference? Not necessarily. Fatima, it could be more so that when you're drawing on that academic knowledge, what we don't want to spend the response doing is just being a bit of a textbook and just throwing everything out. If you've got like quotes to use, you might want to have like a little appendice at the bottom to say where it came from, like a footer. But I wouldn't spend too much time drawing on specific academic quotes or citing anything. As I said, it's not an academic essay that you're writing. So someone has asked about what if the majority of your experience was more than 5 years ago? Yeah, certainly if you feel that it is most relevant, it probably is a good idea. The reason why I just mentioned trying to keep things within the last 5 years was just so that you could align more so to sort of modern programs and everything that schools will be participating in. But certainly don't feel as though, okay, well, I've got nothing to talk about. Just really think about what the criterion is asking for and how you can best respond to it. Sorry, I'm just scrolling down to see if there's any other ones. So someone's already written, do we have to write different ones for different schools? Can we keep using the same one? Yep, we've already had a chat about that. I'm coming from teaching at TAFE and uni. Is it okay to draw from those teaching experiences? Yep, definitely. Still classroom teaching, that's for sure. But again, you might want to reflect on how you might apply it to a different age group of students or to different content. Thanks, Bernadette. Your positivity is great too. Awesome. And then I'm just moving back down the bottom. Those were questions I got put up right up at the start. So we might have some different ones now. So someone has said, my background's working in a call center. I don't know how to incorporate this into my responses. So if you've had the opportunity to work previously, if you work as part of a team, if you collaborate, your communication, you could definitely talk about management, how you involve yourself in professional learning and reflection. So there's, again, probably applicable things, not entirely relevant, but still little bits and pieces you can tease out. So someone else has asked about education support staff selection criteria. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to do that today, but certainly Bindu, if you would like some specific advice, if you have questions, my email address is on that last slide. So please do feel free to get in contact with me. When applying, are there any other places to look for jobs in a VIT website, a recruitment online, independent schools online, even individual schools' websites? Some schools will even, if they've got a Facebook page, actually put up jobs there. The school that I used to teach at used to do like a cool little visual thing, like a post on their Facebook page, and it's like, do you know anyone else who's a teacher? Tell them about these positions. So social media, there's so much that's being communicated there. Awesome. Just having a quick look. I'm moving from primary to secondary. How can I best use this? Of course, there's going to be things that are applicable to both sides. And as we've already seen, there's similarities anyway with the actual criteria points, sort of common themes. You can still talk about assessment. I'd be more so, again, bringing it back to that E in the STAIR extension. So how are you taking that example or experience to apply to this role, to this context, to this new age group that you're teaching? And so someone's also asked about, can you review my key selection criteria response? if it was its own role, I'd love to be able to sit down with everybody and walk you all through all of your criteria responses, but that is quite a thing to take on. So, I mean, I'm more than happy if you've got maybe particular questions, or you just want to be steered in a direction of maybe someone that you could go to offer you that sort of support. More than happy if you've got those emails, or if you've got a particular spot you're really, really struggling with, I might be able to do that. But unfortunately, there's not really the space to be able to look through everybody's one word for word, unfortunately. But I really appreciate everybody's time. As I said, if you've had more specific questions that have come up here that I haven't had a chance to look at, I will be reading back through this data and then trying to contact you individually. What you will be receiving shortly is that survey. So again, if you would like access to the PowerPoint, simply indicate yes, and I'd be more than happy to share that access with you. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time and your participation today. This is an area that I always love to chat about, and I hope that there's been at least one thing that you've been able to take away from the session that you'll be able to try to incorporate to make your response even better. But best of luck, everybody, with your job applications for next year. It was wonderful to chat with you, and have a lovely weekend. See you soon. Bye.